4 years after my mother died, my brother slid a single sheet of paper across a polished conference table and told a room full of people that she had written it. He was wrong. The only reason I could prove he was wrong was a recipe card in my kitchen. Pumpkin bread, 2 eggs, underlined twice, written in the green-black ink my mother used her whole life, the ink from my father's old fountain pen. Because she said ballpoint made her feel like she was signing for a package she never ordered. I knew that ink the way you know a person's footsteps in the hall. I could have picked it out of 100 samples. And the page my brother set on that table, the one that was supposed to quietly hand him $90,000 of our mother's estate, was written in blue. That, it turns out, is the whole reason I'm able to tell you this story at all. Let me tell you who I am first, because it matters less than you'd think, and more than he wanted it to. My name is Helen Cavanaugh. I'm 47 years old, and for most of my life, I was the one nobody worried about. The steady one. The one who got on with it. I read documents for a living. I'm a forensic accountant, which is a long way of saying that when numbers and paper disagree with each other, people pay me to find out which one is lying. My brother knew what I did. He just never once imagined I would do it to him. I want to take you all the way back, because a lie like the one he told doesn't appear out of nowhere. It grows in soil that was tilled a long time ago. And if you've ever been the dependable child in a family that quietly decided your reliability meant you didn't need anything, then stay with me. You already know the soil, I mean. We grew up in a grey house on Linden Street, in a town small enough that the man at the hardware counter knew which of us had been sent and what we'd been sent for. My father, Thomas Cavanaugh, kept the books for a lumber yard on the edge of town for 31 years. He was not a warm man. He was a precise one. And the 2 things I inherited from him, the only 2 things really, were a distrust of round numbers and the habit of writing everything down. My brother is Daniel. He's 4 years older than me, and from the time he could smile, he understood that a smile was a kind of currency. People handed him things. Teachers handed him second chances. Our mother handed him the benefit of every doubt she had, and she had a great many. Ruth Cavanaugh loved both her children. I believe that to this day. But she loved Daniel the way you love weather, helplessly, and with a kind of awe. I loved her the way you love a job you're good at. I showed up. Here is the earliest entry in the ledger, and I call it a ledger on purpose, because that's how my mind has always stored my family. The summer I was 9, Daniel borrowed $40 from the coffee can over the stove to buy a bicycle part and never put it back. I knew because I counted that can every Sunday, not out of suspicion, just out of habit, the way my father taught me. When the $40 went missing, my mother's first instinct was to ask me if I'd miscounted. I hadn't miscounted. I never miscount. But I learned something that summer that took me 30 years to put into words. In our house, the truth and the accusation didn't always land on the same person. The truth landed on Daniel. The question landed on me. I'm not telling you this for your pity. I'm telling you because it's the first page, and you can't understand the last page without it. Let me give you one Sunday, because one Sunday will tell you everything about the table I grew up at. We ate at 2 in the afternoon, every week, my father at the head, my mother at the stove, until the last possible second, and my Aunt Carol, my mother's younger sister, in the chair nearest the good light, because Aunt Carol believed she photographed badly and arranged her whole life around the problem. I was 11. Daniel was 15 and already 6 feet tall, and already the sun the rest of us orbited. That particular Sunday, Daniel had torn the storm door clean off its lower hinge coming in because he'd kicked it open with a football under each arm. And the conversation at the table, I remember this with a clarity I reserve for very few happy things, was about how strong he was getting, how fast, what the coach had said. My father mentioned, mildly, that the door would cost something to fix, and my mother said boys will be boys in a voice that closed the subject like a drawer. The week before, I had reorganized the entire spice cabinet alphabetically and relabeled every jar in my best handwriting because my mother had said once, in passing, that she could never find the cumin. Nobody mentioned the cabinet. I hadn't done it to be mentioned, but I sat at that table listening to a broken door become a tribute, and I understood, in the wordless way children understand the weather of their own house, that being useful and being seen were two different economies, and I had been born into the wrong one. Aunt Carol is the one person who ever named it out loud. Years later, at my father's funeral, she took my hand in the parking lot and said, "You know, Helen, your mother spent so much time watching Daniel, she forgot to watch you, and the terrible thing is you turned out better for it." I didn't know what to say. I still don't, entirely, but I kept the sentence, the way I keep everything, filed it, dated it. It comes back to me at odd hours. Daniel went out into the world the way a thrown stone goes out fast, bright, and downhill. He had a gift for beginnings, a restaurant that was going to change the town, a construction company with a logo before it had a single client. A friend's tech idea he got in early on, except early turned out to mean he'd put in money he didn't have. And every time the ark bent back toward Earth, there was a phone call to our mother, and after the phone call, there was a check. The checks were never discussed with me. I found out about them later, much later, in the way I find out about everything on paper. Let me give you one of them, because the pattern matters more than the list. The biggest was the restaurant. Daniel was 34, and he had found a space downtown, the old florist's shop on Main, and he was going to turn it into the kind of place the town didn't know it wanted yet. He called it Tavolo. He had the name before he had the lease, and the lease before he had the money, and the money, when it came in a single afternoon from a woman who had spent her whole marriage frightened of touching her own savings. I know the amount now. $41,000, withdrawn from one of my mother's certificates of deposit in the September after my father died, when she was at her loneliest and my brother was at his most charming. Tavolo opened the following spring. It served 63 dinners. I know that too, because Daniel, who never kept a record of anything that might be used against him, kept the very first reservation book out of some sentimental impulse, and I found it years later in a box at the house, and I counted. 63 dinners, and then a padlock, and then a phone call to our mother that I wasn't on but can reconstruct down to the pauses. She never asked for the $41,000 back. She told me, much later, when the words were already starting to leave her, that she had decided to think of it as a gift so that it wouldn't have to be a loss. I've decided that's wisdom. I'm allowed to decide. Here is the part that matters for everything that comes after. When my brother sat down 4 years ago to invent a debt our mother owed him, he was not improvising from nothing. He was reaching for a story the family already half believed, that money flowed toward Daniel because Daniel had needs, and that the rest of us, the steady ones, were simply the banks it flowed out of. He thought he was telling a familiar story. He didn't know the bank had kept the ledger. Let me jump ahead, because I promised you a folder and a conference table, and I don't want you to think I've forgotten. But I'll get to that. First, you need to understand what the last years were actually like, because Daniel built his lie on the assumption that no one in the room would know. I knew. I was there. The fall my mother turned 74, she started losing words. Small ones at first, the name of the street she'd lived on for 40 years, the word for the thing you open a can with. Her doctor used a careful, terrible vocabulary and then a clearer one. By the following spring, the diagnosis had a name, and the name came with a tremor. Her right hand, the writing hand, began to shake. I want you to hold on to that detail. The tremor. We'll come back to it, and when we do, it will matter more than any number. For the last 3 years of her life, I drove the 90 minutes to Linden Street every weekend, and most Wednesdays too. I'm not going to pretend that was pure devotion. Some of those drives I made angry. Some of them I made because the alternative was lying awake, imagining her alone with a stove she'd forgotten to turn off. But I made them. 51 weeks a year, give or take, for 3 years. You can do that arithmetic if you want. I have. It comes to a number I don't say out loud, because saying it sounds like a bill, and I never wanted it to be a bill. Daniel visited twice. 2 visits. In 3 years. I'm not rounding. The first was Christmas of the first year, when she still knew everyone, and the house still smelled like the pumpkin bread on that recipe card. He stayed 4 hours, took photographs of himself beside her chair, and left before the dishes. The second was 8 months before she died, a Sunday in autumn, and he spent most of it on the back porch on his phone, talking to a man about a deal that, like all his deals, was about to come together any day now. Meanwhile, I kept records. I have always kept records. It's not a virtue, it's closer to a compulsion, but it is the reason I can tell you, to the dollar, who paid for what in that house during those 3 years. I paid for the wheelchair ramp her cousin's son built $1,800. My card, March of the 2nd year. I paid the homemaid, Marisol, who came 4 mornings a week for the last 14 months, $1,200 a month, every month by automatic transfer from my own account. When the roof over the back bedroom failed in a February storm, I wrote the check to the roofing company myself. $18,400. I remember the number because I remember standing in the kitchen, looking at the figure and thinking, calmly, that there went the kitchen I'd been planning to renovate for 6 years. Let me slow down and give you one weekend, because the money is only the skeleton and you should see the body. A Saturday in the last winter, I left my apartment at 6 in the morning so I could be on Linden Street by 7:30, because that was when Marisol's weekend shift ended and my mother could not be left alone for the gap. Marisol Reyes, I want you to know her full name, because she showed up the way family is supposed to, and would have the coffee already made, and she'd give me the night's report standing in the front hall in her coat, slept until 3, asked for your father twice, ate half the toast. Then Marisol would go home to her own life, which I knew almost nothing about, to my shame, and I would step into the day. The day was small, and it was endless. There was the matter of the pills, 7 of them, in a plastic organizer with the days of the week printed on the lids, and the new trouble that my mother had started hiding them under her tongue, not out of refusal but out of some private fear I never fully understood. There was the matter of the bath, which by that winter required 2 of us, and a chair and a kind of cheerful narration I taught myself to keep up, so that neither of us had to sit in the indignity of it. There was the matter of lunch, which she could still mostly manage, and the matter of the afternoon, which was the hardest, because the afternoons were when she knew. When the fog lifted just enough to show her the shape of what was happening, and she would look at me with my father's distrust of round numbers in her eyes and say, "Helen, this isn't going to get better, is it?" And I would not lie to her because I have never been able to lie. And that, it turns out, is the whole point of this story. Her doctor was a patient woman named Anne Okafor, who took my calls after hours, more times than any contract required, and who told me once that the children who do this work rarely get thanked by the family and never by the parent, because by the time the work is hardest, the parent is already past thanking. She was almost right. My mother thanked me once, at the very end, and I've already told you what she said, and I'll let it stay where it is. By 4 o'clock, the light would go flat and grey over the back garden, and I would sit with her while a program she no longer followed murmured on the television, and I would do my own work on a laptop balanced on the arm of the couch, because the firm did not stop needing me just because my mother did. I want you to picture that, because it's the truest picture I have. A woman doing forensic accounting on a couch in a dim living room, one hand on a keyboard, one hand on her mother's hand, listening for the change in breathing that meant a nap had become something more frightening. That was the weekend. 51 of them a year, give or take, for 3 years. And 90 minutes home in the dark on Sunday night, every Sunday night, with the radio off because some kinds of tired don't want company. My mother's own money, her savings, her 2 certificates of deposit, the small brokerage account my father had left her that money mostly sat, she was frightened of spending it. Children of her generation often were. So it sat, and it grew a little, and when she died it was still there, almost untouched. A quiet pile of just over $150,000 sitting beside a house the appraiser would later value at $338,000. $495,000, all told. Round it if you like. Daniel certainly did. She died on a Tuesday in early April, at home, with Marisol holding one of her hands and me holding the other. I won't spend long here, because she would not have wanted me to, and because grief described at length stops being grief and starts being performance. I'll only tell you that the last fully clear thing she said to me 2 days before was, "Thank you for keeping everything straight, Helen. You always kept everything straight." I thought she meant the house. The pills, the appointments, the bills. I understand now, she may have meant more than that. The funeral was the largest gathering Daniel had attended in years. He flew in the night before. He stood at the front of the room in a charcoal suit and spoke for 11 minutes about a closeness between him and our mother that I had personally watched not happen. He talked about Sunday phone calls. He talked about being her rock. A woman from her church leaned over to me afterward and said, "Your brother is just so devoted." And I said yes, and I meant nothing by it, and that nothing is a thing I'm still a little ashamed of. Because here is the first uncomfortable admission: I owe you, and there will be others. I let it stand. At the funeral, at the luncheon, in the weeks after, I let the room believe the version of my brother that my brother was selling. I told myself it was dignity. Some of it was. But some of it was the oldest habit I had, the reliable one, getting on with it, not making a scene. I had spent 36 years being the child who didn't need anything, and I did not know how to stop, even standing over my mother's casket. The luncheon afterward was held in the church hall, with the folding tables and the coffee urn that wheezed, and the food that town women bring in covered dishes when someone dies, the scalloped potatoes, the ham, the lemon squares, on paper doilies. Daniel worked that room like a man running for office. He hugged people who had to be reminded who he was. He told the story about the Sunday phone calls 4 separate times, and by the 4th telling, there were details that hadn't been there in the first. A thing I noticed, the way you notice a figure that's been quietly revised between 2 drafts of the same report. A man from the lumber yard, retired now, old Walt Brennan, who had worked beside my father for 20 years and later gave me my own first job counting other people's money, found me by the coffee urn. He didn't say anything about devotion. He said, "Your dad would have known what you did these last years, Helen. He kept his books the same way you keep yours." Then he squeezed my shoulder and went to get a lemon square, and that was the only thing said to me all afternoon that I carried home. I drove back to the empty apartment that night, and I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where all of this would eventually be proven, and I did not cry. I have thought about why. I think it was because some part of me already knew the grieving wasn't finished, that there was a second act coming, the way you can tell from the shape of a balance sheet that a number somewhere is going to need explaining. I just didn't know yet that my brother would be the one to write it. That habit nearly cost me $90,000. Stay with me and you'll see exactly how. The will was simple. My mother had made it with a local attorney named Edith Park 9 years earlier, and it said what I expected it to say. The estate, after expenses, divided equally between her 2 children. 50-50. No surprises, no secret codicils, no last-minute change of heart, just the house, the accounts, and the 2 of us. If the story ended there, it would be a fair story, and a boring one. Daniel did not intend for it to end there. The first meeting at Edith Park's office was a Thursday in late May, 6 weeks after the funeral. I remember the conference room had a window that looked out on a parking lot and a fern that needed water and a long table with that high shine that makes you afraid to set down a coffee cup. Edith was kind and efficient. She laid out the inventory of the estate, the appraisal of the house, the account balances. The arithmetic was clean. After final expenses, each of us stood to receive a little under $247,000. And that is the moment Daniel reached into a leather portfolio he had brought, the kind of portfolio men buy when they want to look like they own portfolios, and he set a single sheet of paper on the shining table. He set it down carefully. He smoothed it once with 2 fingers. Then he said, "Before we divide anything, there's a debt that has to be settled. Mum borrowed money from me, a lot of it, for the roof, for her care, for keeping the house going. I never asked her to pay it back while she was alive, but it's owed and it should come out of the estate before Helen and I split the rest." The room got very quiet. Edith asked, "Of course, how much?" $90,000, my brother said. I looked at the sheet of paper on the table. I didn't touch it. I'm a forensic accountant. Touching the evidence is the first mistake amateurs make, and grief was making me an amateur. So I sat on my hands, literally, and I read it from where I sat. It was a promissory note, handwritten. It said, in cursive, that Ruth Cavanaugh acknowledged borrowing $90,000 from her son Daniel between the years in question for home repairs and medical care, and promised that the sum be repaid to him from her estate. It was dated the 14th of March of the 2nd year of her illness. And at the bottom, it carried her signature. Her signature, smooth, looping, confident. That was the first thing that was wrong. And I want you to understand that I felt it before I could explain it. Felt it in my stomach, the way you feel a stare that isn't there in the dark. My mother could not have signed her name like that on the 14th of March of that year. By that spring, her hand shook so badly she signed her own birthday cards to me in a wandering scrawl that broke my heart a little every time. I had a drawer full of that scrawl at home. This signature belonged to a steadier woman, a younger one. It belonged, I would later prove, to 2014. But I didn't say any of that in the room. Here's what I said. I said, "May I have a copy?" That's all. May I have a copy? Daniel relaxed when I said it. I watched him relax. Because a person asking for a copy is a person being managed, and he had been managing me my whole life. Edith made a copy on the machine in the corner. He took his original back and slid it into the leather portfolio and zipped it, and the small sound of that zipper is a sound I can still hear. I drove the 90 minutes home with the copy on the passenger seat, face down, because I didn't want to look at it at red lights. And somewhere on the highway, the grief that had been sitting on my chest for 6 weeks got up and made room for something else. Something cooler. Something I was very, very good at. I keep the receipts. I have always kept the receipts. And my brother had just told a room full of people a story that the receipts could either confirm or destroy. Let me tell you how an audit actually feels, because it is not the dramatic thing you might picture. It is slow. It is patient. It is a person at a kitchen table at 11 at night with 3 highlighters and a stack of bank statements, building a timeline so detailed that a lie has nowhere left to stand. A lie can survive almost anywhere. The one place it cannot survive is a timeline. Put a false thing on a calendar next to all the true things around it, and it begins to suffocate. So I built the calendar, entry by entry. The first thing I did was the simplest, and it's the thing Daniel never expected, because he never once thought of me as a threat. I requested the complete estate records as a beneficiary, which is my right, and I asked Edith for the full account histories going back 10 years. Not the balances, the histories, every deposit, every withdrawal, every check, every transfer, from every account my mother had ever held. Then I sat down with the note, his note, the $90,000 note, and I started checking it against the world. The note claimed the money had been lent for, among other things, the roof. I almost laughed when I read that, sitting at my kitchen table, the same kitchen I'd given up renovating to pay for that exact roof, because I had the cancelled check. $18,400, written by me to Halverson Roofing, cleared on the 9th of February, my account, my signature, not Daniel's, not a loan from Daniel. There was no transfer from any account of his to anyone on any date for any roof. That was entry 1. I wrote it down. The note claimed the money had paid for her care, for the aid. For Marisol, $1,200 a month, 14 months. I had every one of those transfers. Every single one came out of my account automatically on the 1st of the month and landed in Marisol's. I had the confirmations. I had, God help me, the thank you text from Marisol each month with the little folded hands emoji she always sent. There was no money from Daniel, none. Not a dollar reached that house from my brother in 3 years, and I could prove the absence the way you prove a room is empty by walking through every inch of it with the light on. That was entry 2, but absence of money is a soft proof. A clever man can argue around it. He can say it was cash, no record, hand to hand. So I needed something harder than absence. I needed the note itself to lie. I needed it to contradict the calendar in a way that no story could repair. And it did. Oh, it did. The note named an account. To look official, Daniel had written that the loan was to be repaid into, and I'm quoting from memory, but I have it framed in my files, my account at Sound Federal Savings. He even wrote the last 4 digits. It was a nice touch. It's the kind of detail people add when they want a lie to feel specific, and specificity is usually the friend of the truth, which is exactly why liars reach for it. It was not his friend that day. Because I pulled Daniel's own disclosure, Beneficiaries can request that too when a claim is made against an estate, and Sound Federal Savings told a story of its own. That account, the one written into a note dated the 14th of March of the second year, had not existed on the 14th of March of the second year. It was opened in August of the following year, 17 months after the date on the document that referenced it. I sat very still when I found that. I want to describe the feeling honestly, because it was not triumph. It was closer to vertigo. My brother had reached into the future, taken an account number that did not yet exist, and written it into our dying mother's hand. A note cannot reference an account that won't be opened for another 17 months. It is not a matter of interpretation. It is not a question of whose memory is better. It is arithmetic, and arithmetic does not grieve, and arithmetic does not take sides, and arithmetic does not care that he was the favorite. That was entry 3, the one that mattered, the back date. But let me tell you how I confirmed that date, because I didn't take it on faith, and neither should you. I called Sound Federal Savings, and after the usual maze, I reached a soft-spoken man in their records department named Gerald Pinto, who had the great virtue of caring about being precise. I explained that I was a beneficiary with a documented claim against an estate, which was true, and that I needed to confirm the opening date of an account by its number, which was within my right. He put me on hold for 11 minutes. I timed it. Timing things is what my hands do when my chest is tight. When he came back, he read me the date, and I wrote it down, and then I asked him to read it once more so I could be certain. And he did, kindly, without ever asking why a woman needed to hear a date twice. August. The year after the note. 17 months too late to be true. I sat with that for a long while. Then I did the thing I always do when a case stops being numbers and becomes a person. I called Walt Brennan, the man who had found me at the funeral, the man who had given me my first job counting other people's money. He was older now, slower on the phone, but his mind for this had never dulled. I laid it out the way I'd lay it out for a partner: the note, the round number, the roof I had paid for myself, the account that didn't yet exist. He was quiet for a moment. Then he said the thing I needed someone outside my own grief to say. He said, "Helen, that is not a misunderstanding between a brother and a sister. That is a manufactured instrument, and you know the difference." And then, more gently, he asked, "Do you want it to be true that it isn't?" I told him the truth. No, I wanted to be wrong. I have rarely in my life wanted my own arithmetic to fail as badly as I wanted it to fail that night. It didn't fail. It never does. That is the loneliest thing about being good at this. I had 2 more things to check before I would let myself sleep. The handwriting was one, and the silence on the page was the other. I could have stopped there. I want you to know that. I had enough, on entry 3 alone, to walk into Edith Park's office and end it. But I am my father's daughter, and my father distrusted round numbers, and 90,000 is the roundest number there is. A man who fabricates a debt picks a round number because round numbers feel like decisions and odd numbers feel like records. So I kept going because I wanted the calendar to be so complete that not 1 square inch of doubt was left for anybody to stand on. Not Daniel. Not the churchwoman who thought he was devoted. Not, if I'm honest, the small, frightened 9-year-old still living somewhere in me who had been asked if she'd miscounted. I hadn't miscounted. I have never miscounted. So, entry 4, the handwriting. This is where the recipe card comes back. This is where the green-black ink comes back. Because the note, his note, was written in blue. A blue gel ink smooth and modern, the kind that comes in a pack of a dozen from the office store. My mother never owned such a pen. I am not exaggerating for effect. In 40 years, I never once saw my mother write in blue. She wrote in the green-black ink of my father's fountain pen, and when that pen finally gave out, she bought bottled ink to refill it rather than switch. And she did that until her hand could no longer hold the pen at all. The recipe card is green-black. Her birthday cards to me are green-black. The grocery lists I found in her coat pockets after she died, which I could not throw away and still cannot, are every one of them green-black. The note that was supposed to be her dying wish was written in blue gel ink by a steady hand referencing an account from the future. And the signature, the smooth, looping, confident signature, I found its twin. I went through her old checks, the ones I'd boxed up from the house, and I found a check from 2014 written to her dentist, and the signature on it was identical to the signature on the note. Not similar, identical. Down to the little hook on the final letter, the place where two real signatures by the same hand always vary by a hair and never ever match exactly. Hers matched exactly because it had been traced. That was the thing that finally made me put my pen down at the kitchen table. Not anger. I keep waiting, even now, to feel the anger people assume I felt, and it never quite arrives. What I felt was a deep, settling sadness, because I understood that my brother had sat somewhere with a 2014 check and a light box or a sunny window and had traced our mother's name onto a lie, slowly, carefully, the way a forger does, while I was driving 90 minutes every weekend to make sure she didn't leave the stove on. We both spent those years doing careful, patient work. We were just building different things. There was one last thing, and it was a silence rather than a number, but it sealed everything else. A note for $90,000, meant to be honored by an estate, would in the ordinary course of things be witnessed, notarized. Even if a person had any sense, it might one day be questioned. My mother had been raised by my father, the most careful man in the county, to witness and date and file everything she touched. She practically notarized her grocery lists. And yet this enormous claim carried nothing. No witness, no notary stamp, no second signature, just a traced name in blue ink on a single unguarded page. I understood why. A witness is a living person who can be asked, under oath, when they actually signed. Daniel could not afford to be tied to a date that a real human being might remember wrong or right. So he left the page bare. And the bareness, to me, was as loud as the account number had been. It was the silence where a careful woman's whole lifetime of caution should have been, and wasn't. Let me come up for air for a moment, because I've given you a lot of numbers, and you deserve to know where the feeling lives in all of this. People hear forensic accountant and they picture someone cold, someone who reduces a family to a spreadsheet. And I understand why. But I want to tell you that every entry I made on that calendar cost me something. Entry 1 was the roof, which was also the kitchen I never got. Entry 2 was Marisol, which was also 14 months of mornings. I wasn't there because I was at work paying for the mornings I wasn't there. Entry 3 was the account, which was the moment I finally understood my brother was not weak or desperate, but deliberate. And entry 4 was her handwriting, which was the recipe card, which was the pumpkin bread, which was the smell of a kitchen that doesn't exist anymore. The spreadsheet was never just a spreadsheet. It was the last thing she said to me. You always kept everything straight, Helen. I was about to find out what that was worth. The night before the second meeting, my cousin Renee called me. She is Aunt Carol's daughter, the only one in the extended family Daniel had never fully charmed, and someone had let slip to her that there was a dispute over the estate. She wanted to know if it was true that I was, in her words, fighting Daniel over money at a time like this. I want you to hear that sentence the way I heard it, because it is the exact machinery the quiet ones get caught in. Not who lied, not who forged, just why are you making trouble? Why can't you get on with it? I almost explained myself to her. I had the folder right there on the table. I could have read her the account date over the phone and won her in 30 seconds. And then I did something that I think was the first genuinely new thing I had ever done in that family. I didn't. I said, "Renee, you'll hear about it after, and you can decide for yourself then." And I hung up, and I sat in the quiet, and I noticed that the sky did not fall. I had declined to perform my own innocence for someone who had already half convicted me, and the world had simply gone on turning. That is the thing the audit gave me that the money never could. For 36 years, I had believed that being trusted required being explained, that I had to show my work to everyone, all the time, or be assumed guilty. The folder on my table said otherwise. It said the work was already done, and it was correct, and correct does not need a chorus. It only needs to be opened, once, in front of the one person who has to see it. So I went to bed, and in the morning I drove the 90 minutes with the folder on the passenger seat, face up this time. Now let me take you to the second meeting, because the first one I walked into as a grieving daughter, and the second one I walked into as something else. It was a Tuesday in July, mid-morning, the same conference room, the same fern still gasping in the corner. Daniel was there before me, which was unusual, in a new suit, looking like a man who had already spent the money. Edith Park sat at the head of the table with the estate file, and I came in with one thing. A plain manila folder, 11 pages inside it. I set it down on the high-shine table in front of me, squared it to the edge, the way my father squared everything, and I left it closed. I want to tell you I had a speech prepared. I didn't. People who have the truth don't need a speech. They need a folder and the patience to open it one page at a time. Edith began by asking whether we'd resolved the matter of the claimed debt. Daniel jumped in before I could speak. He always did. He said that he understood it was awkward, that he didn't want to upset his sister during a hard time, but that the note was the note, our mother's wishes were our mother's wishes, and he hoped I could respect that. He was good. I'll give him that for the rest of my life. He was so good that for 1/2 of 1 second, watching Edith nod sympathetically, I felt the old gravity pull at me, the urge to be reasonable, to not make a scene, to get on with it. And then I opened the folder. I didn't raise my voice. I have never once raised my voice at my brother. Not as a child, not that day, not since. I slid the first page across the table, the way he had slid his note across it in May, and I said, "This is the cancelled check for the roof. My account, my signature, February. There was no loan from you for the roof, Daniel. I paid for the roof." He started to speak. I slid the second page. "This is 14 months of transfers to Marisol Reyes, the homemaid. My account, every one. There was no loan from you for her care. I paid for her care." The third page. The fourth. I laid them down one by one, and I did not editorialize, because the pages did not need my help. The ramp, the pharmacy, the property taxes, the utilities. Page after page, every dollar he claimed to have lent, traced back to a hand that was not his. Mine, 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 mine. And then I stopped, and I let the quiet do what quiet does, and I slid the page that mattered. This, I said, is the account history for the account written on your note. You wrote that Mum borrowed this money and would repay it into your account at Sound Federal Savings. You even wrote the last 4 digits. Here is when that account was opened, Daniel. Read the date. He didn't read it. He didn't have to. I watched the thing happen in his face that I had driven 90 minutes home in May, hoping I would never have to watch. I watched my brother understand that he had been caught not by a stranger, not by a bank, not by a judge, but by me. The one who didn't matter, the one who got on with it. The account, I said quietly, was opened 17 months after the date you wrote on the note. The note references an account that did not exist when the note was supposedly signed. A document cannot do that, Daniel. Mom could not have known a number that wouldn't be assigned for another year and a half. Only you could. Edith Park had gone very still. She is a careful person, and careful people know the exact weight of a backdated instrument. She asked to see the page. I gave it to her. I gave her all of them. I had brought copies. I always bring copies. There was one more page, and I confess I considered not laying it down. The first 4 pages were business. The account date was the kill. The last page was personal. And personal is where audits are supposed to stop. But I laid it down anyway, and I have made my peace with that, because she was my mother too. The last page was the note beside the recipe card, the forgery beside the truth, blue gel ink beside green black, the Trace 2014 signature beside her real, shaking, broken signature from the actual year on the document, the wandering scrawl from a birthday card she'd sent me that very spring. A signature that looked like it had been written on a train. I didn't say much about it. I said, this is how Mom really signed her name that year. Her hand shook. It had shaken for 2 years by then. The signature on your note is from 2014. I can show you the check it was copied from. That was all. That was the whole reckoning. No shouting. No tears at the table, no security escorting anyone out. Just 11 pages and a quiet room and the slow, terrible arithmetic of a thing that did not add up. Daniel said one word. He said my name, Helen. And here is the second uncomfortable thing I owe you, the one I've turned over more nights than I'll admit. When he said my name, in that small, cracked voice, with the new suit and the empty portfolio, and 47 years of being the bright one collapsing in real time for one moment, I wanted to gather the pages back up. I wanted to make it not have happened. He was my brother. He was the boy who taught me to ride a bike on Linden Street, badly, by pushing me down the hill and yelling that I'd figure it out. And I had figured it out, and we had laughed until we couldn't breathe. That boy was somewhere inside the man who traced our mother's name onto a lie. I have never been able to fully hate him, and I've stopped trying. Hate would have been easier. It would have let me off the hook of loving him. But I didn't gather the pages. I left them on the table, because mercy that erases the truth isn't mercy. It's just another kind of forgery. Let me tell you what actually happened, because the truth doesn't end with a slammed gavel, and I won't pretend it did. Daniel withdrew the claim that afternoon. He had to. Edith made it gently clear that a backdated instrument presented to an estate is not a thing that stays a private family matter if anyone chooses to make it otherwise, and that the choice belonged to me. He withdrew it in a short email 2 days later, 3 sentences, no apology in any of them. The estate was divided the way our mother had actually wanted it divided, 50-50. A little under $247,000 each. He got exactly what he would have gotten if he had simply waited and grieved and let the will be the will. Think about that. He risked everything, traced a dead woman's name, invented a future account, all to take $90,000 that, in the end, he didn't take. He could have just let me love him. It would have been free. I did not report him. I want to be honest that this was not pure mercy either. It was partly that he was my brother, and partly that dragging it further would have meant living inside it for another 2 years, and I had given that family enough years. I told him in my own short email that the claim was withdrawn, the estate would settle as written, and that I did not want to see him at holidays. That was the only sentence in my email that I rewrote more than once. I did not want to see him. After a lifetime of showing up, the one thing I finally asked for was to not have to. He did not fight me on it. People rarely fight for the relationships they were willing to forge a signature to rob. We are not estranged in the dramatic way. There was no scene, no thrown glass, no relatives forced to pick sides. It is quieter than that, and quieter is worse. We simply do not speak. He sends a card at Christmas in blue ballpoint, and I do not answer it. And the not answering is the most honest thing I do all year. Here is what I did with my half, because I think she would want you to know it, and because it's the only part of this story that still makes me cry 4 years on. I took $18,400 of it, the exact amount of the roof, the exact amount of the kitchen I gave up, and I started a small fund at the community college 2 towns over in our mother's name. The Ruth Cavanaugh Award. It goes every spring to a returning student over the age of 40 who is the first in their family to go back to school. Quiet people, steady people, the ones nobody worried about. The ones who kept everything straight for everybody else for so long that they forgot they were allowed to want something for themselves. The first recipient was a woman named Lorna, 51, who had raised her late sister's 3 children and then enrolled in the nursing program the autumn the youngest one left for college. She wrote me a thank you note. She wrote it by hand, 2 careful paragraphs, and she apologized at the end for her penmanship, and I sat at my kitchen table and laughed and cried at the same time, because her penmanship was lovely, and because she had no way of knowing that handwriting was the whole reason any of this existed at all. I keep her note in the tin box now. Third from the front, right behind the recipe card. The 2 truest pieces of paper I own. I fund it in green-black ink. I write the check by hand every year in my father's old fountain pen, which I had repaired so I could. And I still have the recipe card, third from the front, in the dented tin box. Pumpkin bread, 2 eggs, underlined twice. Some Sundays I make it, and the kitchen smells like Linden Street, and for an hour my mother is a little less gone. So let me leave you not with a lesson, but with a picture, because I've come to trust pictures more than lessons. Picture 2 people sitting in 2 different rooms over the same 3 years. One of them is at a sunny window with a 2014 check and a sheet of paper tracing a name slowly, building a future out of a forgery. The other is at a kitchen table at 11 at night with 3 highlighters and a stack of bank statements, building a calendar out of the truth. They are doing the same careful, patient work, the same long hours, the same steady hands. The only difference, the only one, is what they decided to be careful about. We both kept records, my brother and I. Mine just happened to be real. Now I want to turn to you, because you've stayed this long, and that means something passed between us. Somewhere in your life, there is a coffee can over a stove, and a person who has decided that because you are reliable, you do not need anything. Maybe you've believed it too. Maybe you've gotten so good at getting on with it that you've forgotten you're allowed to set a folder on the table and open it one page at a time in a calm voice without raising it once. You are allowed. You were always allowed. If this story reached something in you, you already know what to do with it. And if there is a quiet one in your family, the one who shows up, the one who keeps everything straight, the one nobody worries about, go find them this week. Don't wait for a will to remind you they were never invisible. The tin box is on the counter. The pen still writes. And the kitchen, for one more Sunday, smells exactly like it should.